Welcome to this panel discussion, which is hosted by CEP, and it's organized by Ronald Stevenick and myself. And myself is Hildegunn Nordahl. So the topic of this roundtable is trade in environmental services, lowering the barriers and seizing the benefits. We are eager to hear from an excellent panel on how progress can be made in opening the markets for environmental services. And let me just introduce let me just introduce the moderator, which is Alice Tipping, and she will moderate the roundtable. And she leads work in on sustainable trade and fishery subsidies at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where she has led a number of research programs and policy dialogues. Before joining IISD, she was a policy advisor to the New Zealand Permanent Mission to the UN in Geneva, and also to the New Zealand Permanent Mission to the WTO. Before I give the floor to Alice, just a few housekeeping rules. So the audience is kindly asked to turn off their mics and cameras, and you are very much welcome to ask questions in the chat, and we will take the questions as far as we can. And with this, I give the floor to Alice.
Thank you very much indeed, Hildegunn. I'm delighted to be moderating this morning's discussion. I actually did in a previous life provide advice to the New Zealand government on services commitments in FTAs, but I very quickly realized that services are certainly the dark arts of trade policy. So I quickly escaped to work on subsidies instead. But I thought I would start perhaps by just sort of a reminder about why is it so important to be talking about environmental services. And at least as I see it, it's essentially because we know that fixing and preventing environmental problems requires expertise, right? The ability not just to build, but also to maintain a wind farm or a sewage system. And to date, there's been a lot of focus in trade policy on environmental goods, so the actual things you need to mitigate and prevent pollution, so valves or pumps, or solar photovoltaic cells if you want to produce renewable energy. But there's actually been less focus, I think, in the general trade policy context, perhaps outside the relatively small and ultra specialized world of services negotiators, on the services that need to be provided to enable environmental solutions to actually be deployed. And in fact, it's thanks to the technological advances of the last 30 years that environmental services now embrace a very wide and a very interesting range of activities. So it's a topic that I think is it's technically interesting, it's politically interesting, because it's essentially about both the science of managing the environment as well as the politics of designing industrial policy, about jobs, and about trade policy. So we're going to talk about a little bit of all of that this morning Geneva time. So the first job I have is to introduce our very distinguished panel, and we're delighted to have them with us. So in alphabetical order, firstly, Peter Brunn is the head of Global Offshore Wind for DNV, which is an independent organization that provides advice, assurance, and risk management to the energy sector and the maritime industry. And among his previous responsibilities, he's worked as Managing Director of the Sustainable Energy Trade Initiative, SETI, including as Head of Government Relations for Vestas, a Danish wind power company everyone's probably very familiar with. And a particular important point to note as I introduce Peter is that he's talking this morning in his personal capacity only. So please bear that in mind as you listen to him. Second in alphabetical order is Crispin Conroy, who is the Representative Director of the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC, in Geneva, and is also a permanent observer of the ICC to the United Nations, with a special focus on private sector engagement in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we will all be familiar with, and the World Trade Organization. So Crispin and I interact on a number of trade issues. Thanks, Crispin, for joining us. John Drummond is next. He heads the Trade and Services Division in the Trade and Agricultural Directorate of the OECD. And in that capacity, he oversees the team that's currently responsible for the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, which in fact Hildegun may have helped to set up. So there's a nice continuity there. And he's also currently developing a Services Trade Restrictiveness Index focusing on environmental services, which will be interesting to hear about. We're hoping to have Ike Ho Lim join us in a few minutes. Ike Ho is the director of the WTO's Trade and Environment Division, and of course serves in that division serves as the secretariat for the WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment. But Ho has a particular advantage in that he also worked as councillor in the WTO's Trade and Services Division. So he has sort of the perfect combination of services and environmental policy and trade expertise. I'm delighted to have on the panel also Ana Laura Lizano, who is a councillor in the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica to the WTO. She's been there since 2005, and she currently co-chairs the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions at the WTO. And that's a particularly interesting initiative that we'll hear about in a bit, in a sense with a foot inside the WTO and a foot outside it. But Ana Laura has a wide expertise on trade policy, but also on technical barriers to trade development and environment. So thanks Ana for joining us. Christine Schaefer is joining us from Canberra. So a particular thanks, Christine, for staying up late at night in Australia. But Christine is Assistant Director in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She specialises in multilateral economic institutions, including APEC, the OECD, a number of UN bodies, and the WTO. She is a trade and services specialist, so one of the masters of the dark arts I was talking about. Although she confessed to us earlier that it's taken her about 15 years to almost understand environmental services. I'm sure she in fact understands a vast amount more than me. So thanks, Christine, for joining us. And last but certainly not least, we have Ron Stevenick, a familiar face and name to everyone here. He's my colleague. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where I work, and until 2018 worked on matters at the intersection of trade and environment for the OECD, including environmental services. So welcome to all of you. It's a star-studded panel, which I will do my best to moderate to best effect. The format for today is we're going to have a first round of discussion from the panelists. I'm then going to give them all the right of reply so they can come back and respond to or comment on anything else that they heard the others say. They haven't prepared it beforehand. And after those first two rounds of exchanges, I'm going to keep a good eye on the chat box. So you'll see the chat function at the bottom of your screen. If you have comments or questions, please put them in there. And once we've had these first two rounds of exchanges with the panel, I'll start to pull out comments and questions from the chat and allocate them as best I can. But not being a services expert, or at least not for the last few years, I would encourage the panelists, if I put the question to the wrong person, feel free to just pass the ball over if you think there's someone better to answer it. So I'm happy to take advice on that count. So with the format and the agenda set, perhaps the best place to start, especially for the benefit of those, including I, who are a little new to the concept of environmental services, or at least need a good refresher, perhaps let's start by nailing down what people mean by this term. And there's no one better to do that than Ron. So Ron, would you like to have a start? What are we talking about when we talk about environmental services?
Thank you so much, Alice, and good morning. I'm sure there are people who are better placed to provide the definition, but I'll try my best. The term environmental services goes back to at least the early 1990s, and there's not an internationally agreed idea of what they comprise, unlike, say, agriculture. But it started to be basically get currency when the United Nations Statistical Division created something they called the Central Product Classification, or CPC for short, and published an early provisional version of it in 1991 that included a two-digit division, number 94, which classified a few environmental services. Now, that list in turn informed what the WTO calls its service sectoral classification list, which is a several-page list of services that are supposed to be exclusive. So there's not supposed to be any overlap across those services. Within that list, there was section 6, which enumerated a small number of environmental services, basically sewage services, refuse disposal services, sanitation and similar services. And I gather sanitation is something in between sewage and refuse, and other environmental services. So this other covers things like environmental consulting services and noise abatement services. At the time, in other words, the focus of discussions of the WTO was on infrastructure-heavy environmental services, particularly those historically provided by governments. But the list was limiting, again, as I said, because the categories are supposed to be non-overlapping. Pretty soon after this came out, various WTO members wanted to see the list broadened, and various alternative sets of services were proposed. But most WTO members, when scheduling commitments, like on national treatment and to environmental services, still reference the WTO's 1991 categorization. So let's fast forward 30 years. New Zealand this year hosted the Asia Pacific Cooperation, or APEC, meetings, and among its various priorities, it sought to revive efforts to open APEC's member economies markets to trade in environmental services. As a starting point, they wanted to understand what kind of services could be called environmental, or at least environmentally relevant. That's where Hildegard and I got involved. Now, while our report covers a lot more, particularly on barriers to trade and services, one thing it did was substantially expand the number of discrete services. How did we do that? Very simply, we looked at the explanatory notes to the latest version of the CPA, which is version 2.1, and identified all services that look to be important for attaining a range of environmental objectives. Where necessary, we identified specific services within broader subclasses of services through the use of X-outs. So anybody who was involved in the previous negotiations on environmental goods remembers that in order to get more specificity in the harmonized system, they would say, well, okay, it's under this 6-digit code, but a subclass of that. So that's what we came up with, more than doubling the number that of services that are under now the current chapter 94. And we're of course pleased that this list ultimately informed the APEC's reference list of environmental and environmentally related services, which you'll hear more about from Christine. Thank you.
Super, Ron. Thank you very much. That's a good kind of reminder of where we've come from. I mean, and it sounds like it's certainly a concept that's in stark evolution, right? Sort of moving from, as you were saying, the original idea to a much more modern interpretation. And the interesting question, I suppose, for us sort of international relations geeks is how that evolving thinking is actually starting to be crystallized down in different places. And this is the perfect segue, in fact, to Christine. So Christine, you were in fact one of the people heavily involved in APEC's work in this area, including getting to this reference list of environmental and environmentally related services. So can you tell us a bit about how that work's gone?
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Ron. That was actually an excellent overview for me, and I think we should have probably had that at the beginning of our negotiation sessions in APEC, because it was difficult to say the least. But there were, I mean, everybody had a lot of momentum among negotiators, particularly with COP 26 and the urgency around climate. I'll just start at the beginning and note that discussion on environmental services are not new to APEC. I remember in 2011, when the United States was hosting APEC, sitting in a meeting in a snow-capped Montana mountain where Hildegard presented via the equivalent of Zoom on OECD's then definition of environmental services. And I have to say, at the time, and still to today, the classification and definition of environmental services is like listening to Latin. That is, I am not fluent. And that is something that was evident throughout the negotiations. what is an environmental service? What are the environmental issues that we're trying to address? How does this list address those environmental issues? What's the logic behind it? What's the logic behind any list, particularly if you look at papers in the WTO and the way that people think around the concept of environmental services? It is an unbelievably complicated idea to get across in some clarity that enables trade negotiators to sell it domestically. However, as Ron said, in November this year, some clarity was brought to the debate with New Zealand, combining its role as host and holder of the pen at the Asia Pacific Economic Community, APEC's year. They led a compendium of work. They were the environmental services champion, which ultimately and incredibly led to a statement by APEC ministers responsible for trade, having a paragraph relating to environmental services, which has been done, but also welcoming and endorsing a non-binding reference list, which we see as the most contemporary and comprehensive list that tries to understand environmental services today. The statement also highlighted how trade policy can serve as an effective tool for pursuing sustainable economic development and enhance access to goods and services that support low emission and climate resilient economies. So APEC ministers adopted the APEC reference list of environmental and environmentally related services. As Ron said, we had to provide a lot of technical support. Services negotiators are a very conservative bunch, and we have a lot of agencies that we have to answer to and explain issues not just related to environmental services, but I cover the whole services agenda. And so you can imagine, I consider it almost like, as a economist said, it's like going into a dark room blindfolded and trying to find a black cat. It's just difficult. And so the simpler way that people can get ideas to us, it really helps. I'll also note for Australia, we had been thinking really hard all year on what an outcome on environmental services could look like. It was one of our top priorities for 2021. Our policy position is we're a very strong proponent of climate mitigation through the adoption and use of new technologies. And we recognise the importance of a broader view when considering the scope of environmental services. One of the main things that our minister said is he wants specialist service providers to be able to move as freely and as easily across borders as the good that they go to service actually moves. I'll sort of leave it there, but there's sort of how it all happened.
Super, thanks, Christine. That's really helpful. And I guess a round of applause for my former colleagues in the New Zealand government for helping to hold the pen and to push this forward. But it's really interesting to see, kind of APEC economies yet again helping to move the ball of trade policy discussions forward. Right, it's not the first time that APEC economies amongst themselves have managed to articulate concepts that in other fora are a bit more difficult. So perhaps moving to fora where we're involving far more economies, the World Trade Organization has been raised a number of times, and we'd be remiss not to turn to them. Aiko, I see you're with us this morning. You may have missed my introduction of you, but thanks very much for joining. I wondered, I was explaining at the beginning, you have the particular advantage of having worked both in the Trade and Services Division in the WTO and now leading the Trade and Environment Division. So you have a sense of how both of those worlds of policy interact. And I wondered if you could add into our discussion, a sense of how you see the different discussions on environmental goods, well, environmental services in particular, moving ahead in the different fora in the WTO, how you see that moving ahead, and perhaps whether you think the progress that the APEC economies have managed to make, whether you think that might have an impact on some of the discussions in the WTO. I guess that's up to members, but if you could give us a sense of how the landscape looks within the WTO, that would be helpful. Go ahead, please.
Thanks very much, Alice. Sorry for being a bit late. Great to join the panel. Great to see also familiar faces. I see John Drummond, who's a veteran of many of these discussions, and good to see Ron, Christine, and everyone. I mean, a lot of expertise on this panel, and actually probably far more than what I have on some of the specific questions. But maybe I can help by a little bit talking about what you finished with in terms of what is happening today at WTO. Some of this you may already be very well aware of, but I think the main thing that we were hoping to have, or we're still going to have from the members, is the 3 statements that they have now. They have already issued, actually, the 3 statements on trade and environmental sustainability, one on plastics pollution, and another one on fossil fuel subsidy reform. So that to me signals, at least amongst this group of members, which now I think come to about, if you count all 3 statements and if you look at who has signed on to all 3 statements, probably come up to something like 70 odd members. So it has been a lot of interest generated in actually just about a year. I mean, since they began saying that they would work towards the issuance of ministerial statements, it has just been 1 year. So certainly it's an issue that seems to be getting people's attention, let's put it that way, and getting commitments to try to work further. So what do they call upon themselves to do? And here I'm talking mainly about the environmental sustainability statement. And you have very clear language here about exploring opportunities to promote, facilitate trade in environmental goods and services, to meet environmental and climate goals. It includes addressing supply chain and technical and regulatory elements. There's also a sort of commitment here to identify and compile best practices, including those that can promote and facilitate access to environmental goods and services, encouraging global uptake of new and emerging low emissions and other climate-friendly technologies. And I think if this develops, and it still remains to be seen how the members will develop this work, because they put for themselves a work program in 2022 with a high-level stock taking at the end of it. There is certainly more, let's say, more energy on environmental goods and services than we've seen for a while since the EGA was suspended in 2016. So what's the APEC part of this? I think APEC's always been there. I mean, APEC, in a way, inspired the EGA when that was launched, because APEC already had its list of 54 environmental goods. APEC, of course, continues to work on environmental services. Much of the work that you do in environmental services through the membership, actually, because there's, APEC members are also WTO members, so they bring it as well to WTO. And that also helps, I think, the discussions here at WTO, both at the political and technical level. And then the questions remain, I think, what sort of urgency is needed? And I think here we are perhaps in a slightly different landscape than we were back in 2012, not necessarily a better landscape, but different, certainly, where urgency of climate change is even stronger, combating climate change, that is, and a lot more is being asked of trade to play a positive role. And people do see this as an important driver for work at WTO. And then you have another important aspect, which is the SDGs, which did not exist at the time when the EGA was launched. And if one looks at the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, again, you have that political framing pushing countries to do more in the space of climate in particular, mitigating and adapting to climate change. But of course, it goes beyond climate to addressing also other environmental concerns. This includes problems of resource and waste, as well as biodiversity. So there's lots of opportunity here to think through what are the types of environmental services in combination with goods that can make a difference. Ron has really gone through some of the challenges and the ways to address these challenges. And I think they will always be there. And I think one thing maybe put it very simply, is that maybe we're asking too much, if I could say, for a perfect solution or perfect list. And it's more about finding practical approaches that is good enough to move ahead with. But what do I mean by good enough? And here I think it also calls for a change in approach, which is going to be difficult. I'm not suggesting it's going to be easy at all. Is that when I look at EGA, environmental services, whether negotiated at WTO or outside WTO, it's always approached as a sectoral trade negotiations, which comes with it a strong, let's call it mercantilist approach, which for all the reasons Christine has already outlined is of course necessary for the trade negotiator to keep in mind. But that's where you have a big challenge, because when it comes to dealing with something like trade and climate or trade and environment, it needs to have a very strong global public goods approach. It's about taking decisions that help improve access to environmental goods and services. And this could well be about decisions taken at home, not necessarily decisions taken abroad. Ideal world both at home and at abroad. But if the focus is always on what am I going to get in another market, it's very different from what the Paris Agreement and the SDGs are asking for. They're mainly asking about how will you use trade to support your nationally determined contributions and your national adaptation plans, less so about what market access you will gain. Of course, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish or naive, that will always be part of the equation as well. But it's a question anyway, whether the changed context is sufficient to help deal with some of these very complicated and complex domestic challenges. If there is, then I think you have the tools. I mean, by work done by APAC, by OECD, some by WTO, some by think tanks, IISD itself, to suggest certain ways forward, be it reference papers, be it model environmental services schedule, or even guidelines on services, classification relevant to environmental services. None are perfect, but they already exist. So is the political will to really use them? That's my few cents worth. Thank you.
I think there are at least a few dollars worth of value in that, Houlihan. Thank you, Super. Thank you very much. And I think just to come back, one thing to pull out and highlight there is this fascinating tension, which I think comes up across all of the areas in which we're trying to use trade policy to achieve environmental objectives. This tension between the natural modus operandi, to speak Latin, of trade negotiators, which is mercantilist. It's the mindset somehow of trade negotiators. And adapting that modus operandi, or trying to shift it when the objective of your negotiation is not just market access, but a broader collective objective, as you were talking about, Houlihan, is something that comes up, I suspect, across a number of different trade and environment questions. And I saw Christine nodding, so she may want to come in the responses round on that. But that's a fascinating tension that we might be able to explore in a bit. I do want to turn now to Anna. Anna, you've been a participant in many of the processes that Houlihan was talking about, both in the Committee, I think, on Trade and Environment, and also specifically the TESSD discussions in the WTO. And Costa Rica, of course, is fascinating in that it is a developing country, but also a member of the OECD, which might, I think, make you quite well placed to understand both developed and developing country perspectives on the question of environmental services. So we'd be really interested in hearing in kind of particular how you see the two distinct perspectives, and in particular, the developing country perspective in a lot of these questions. And I know that in some of our initial sort of pre-discussions, one of the interesting questions we thought was the question of how developed and developing countries, or rather which kinds of services developed and developing countries see as priorities in the environmental services context. So that may be a question you'd like to focus on, but more broadly, can you give us a developing country perspective on this question? What the opportunities are, perhaps what some of the challenges are. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so very much, Alice. And I want to thank firstly the organizers for inviting me. This is an incredible panel. I feel completely outranked because by no means I can call myself an expert on services. And what I do like is to learn, and definitely from this extremely distinguished panel, I will learn a lot this morning. But to address your question, I want to first go perhaps from the micro to the macro. And indeed, Costa Rica is a developing country, and we have a very forward-looking and ambitious agenda. As you mentioned, we have recently joined OECD, and that gives us that dual perspective of things. We do understand that climate change has a cross-cutting impact, and there is a very positive, there's a benefit on improving the services framework, and it spill over to other areas, especially for populations in developing countries. We know that climate change will impact the economically vulnerable the most, and of those women in particular. And I still struggle to understand that climate change has a gender bias. It's amazing. So, coming back to Costa Rica as a developing country with a small economy, we are located in one of the most vulnerable areas to climate shocks in the planet. And as a WTO member that depends on international trade, the impact of climate change in our economy has been more evident, has been more palpable throughout the years. I think it's also worth remembering that LDCs and Sdgs will be also the most vulnerable to climate change because it has shown progressive impacts in logistics, supply chains, agriculture, food security, crop security. And in this line, as we have also seen enhanced by the pandemic, climate change can shorten the supply of essential goods. Sdgs, LDCs, and countries in geographic positions like Costa Rica are particularly vulnerable to tropical cyclones, droughts, floods, and this kind of losses that developing countries experience impact the way they trade, impact the way they consume, impact the way even how we respond to crisis. In this line, to address specifically your question on which kind of services, environmentally friendly or environmental services, are needed to address critical environmental problems, I think that it's worth highlighting that services can enhance mitigation and enable adaptation. And right now, it should be more important than ever to promote digitalization, advanced and clean technologies, and automation to provide more opportunities, and even for women to work from home. And this is something very interesting. I read the report made by Hildegard and Ron. Again, coming back to the gender bias of climate change, this is incredible how it affects women, and how automation and digitalization can assist very much. But for this, we need to promote investment in clean technologies and services, consulting services, because that is the benefit of assuming commitments that allow more investment for modern technologies, clean technologies that allow to provide those services for developing countries. I think that more than thinking of treatment plants or sewage services, we need to think of the technology, bringing those technologies to developing countries, and allow providers to give these services in developing countries where perhaps of certain policies, we keep having monopolies, we keep having very closed markets, and we need to have more openness for these service providers to come and allow developing countries to move ahead. But most importantly, and I think that most relevant to this morning's conversation, is that amidst the climate and health crisis, the versatility of many services and digitalization can seize the new opportunities of trade. Besides being relevant on their own, they are enablers for environmental goods and new or clean technologies. Thank you, Alice.
No, super, Anna, that's really interesting and an extremely useful kind of grounding perspective in the problems that we're actually trying to design our trade policy to address, right? Now, I know that our two representatives from the private sector, Peter and Crispin, are probably itching to jump in. So maybe I'll start with you, Peter. I mean, Anna's just underlined really importantly the importance of trade and services for climate change mitigation adaptation. And Christine, very interestingly at the beginning, talked about her minister's objective, if I understood it correctly, Christine, of ensuring that or enabling services to be traded with as much ease as the goods that they support, which is another important conceptual link to be made. So I wondered, Peter, as somebody with decades of experience in the question of climate change mitigation, renewable energy, and the trade in environmental goods and services to enable that renewable energy to happen, can you give us maybe some examples of the sorts of environmental services you think are crucial to your industry? Are there barriers to those services? What's your experience in general of the concept of trade and services in your industry? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Alice, for the introduction and the questions. I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation here. I started actually my career in being a trade negotiator for Denmark for 14 years, and then I, in 2006, left the public sector, went into the renewable sector, worked for Vestas, and are now working in this new company, DNV. I think this journey has taught me a lot about the two sectors and also the two different approaches. So first, I want to say that I'm very pleased with the panel remarks earlier. I fully agree with Mr. Lim that the landscape is different from before. And the reason why the landscape is different is that we now have a Paris Agreement. We just had a COP26 with a very, very clear conclusion that the change and the reductions of CO2 are not happening fast enough. And therefore, there is a very, very big burden now on the shoulders of government to make it possible, not least for the technology dissemination of climate change, i.e., in other words, have the technologies do their work, make them available in the markets to play the full role. And therefore, I think for trade negotiations, that's really the biggest question these days. I mean, what kind of constructive role can you guys play to make this happen? With my knowledge in the space, I'm not necessarily super optimistic, and I certainly want to be critical. I would put the question to you guys. I mean, is it actually an advantage to get targeted by trade agreements and trade negotiators, you know, with that clear traditional mercantilist approach or tit for tat negotiation? I'm not sure. And we also maybe need to look at what has actually the industry done to make their development so far, because what they have actually been doing is they have been navigating the space with all the barriers that indeed are in this space, and there are a lot. The other reason I want to highlight why the landscape has changed is that, yes, I mean, the technologies will not play their role if they are not being able to scale or to being industrialized. I mean, that is the key route for these technologies to come down in price. It has been going quite well so far, but the next journey is to take them even further down and to enable these technologies to be the least cost options in all markets. And therefore, again, back to this, the moral imperative, of governments. I mean, they simply need not to put burdens and cost on the dissemination of these technologies, whether it's going to be by goods, by service, restrictions, or by NTBs, or by fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, there are many avenues to do this. And now to come to your question about services. Yes, it is a dark hat. I think you called it yourself, at least in the pre-conversation before we started the recordings. It is a very complex space, I have to say. And also in a company I work today, where we are very much engaged of independent certifying the big projects to de-risk the projects for the investors and make them happen, make sure that the projects are built according to international standards, is a very tricky and complex area where where governments are playing around, just to put it, diplomatically. And that certainly is an area also to look into. Also to make a reference to Anna's comments, yes, consultancy services in the broader sense, and the services that, for example, my company is providing, play a critical role for that technology dissemination, but also knowledge building and technology transfer, you can say, actually to come into the market. I think what these mercantilist trade negotiators tend to forget, what renewables actually do is, with them, they bring a lot of knowledge building locally, because these technologies need to be applied locally. They need to be installed locally, and they need to be serviced and maintained locally in their lifetime. And therefore, it is a great political misunderstanding with all the emphasis we have seen in this industry, for local content requirements, forcing a blade factory or forcing an assembly factory into a market with a price tag on, just for the creation of, say, 200 local jobs. Some of these jobs would have come anyway. So also that not understanding, or not, understanding how this industry really works is a big problem, I would say. So I don't think we have the opportunity to go in super detail here. And this is something we can take bilaterally or in further discussions. But yes, service areas also needs to play its role. It may be more advanced as a trade barrier as some of the other areas I mentioned, NTBs and goods. And again, I was deeply involved in both the pre-negotiation of the EGA and during the EGA as an industry spokesperson. Actually, we thought that this was possible because it was, a very targeted sectoral agreement. And it was very, very bad that it didn't happen. Maybe somebody said, yes, you needed to have all the others, and then you could have made a real package. But actually, my take from many trade negotiations and the speed in the markets is not to make things too complicated, to stay simplistic. And here, again, I like the comment by Mr. Lim. Maybe we need to consider a new approach here. And such an approach, if you want to meet the needs of industry and speed in the market and do the moral imperative of COP26, we need a simplistic approach. I think that would be my opening remarks. Thanks.
Super, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, there's a provocative question for the panel. Do trade negotiations with their mercantilistic tendency actually help? Or maybe kind of to put it a bit more constructively, under what conditions can we make sure they help, right? If this is what we want to do. And I think the other really interesting question there was, sort of the politics around the question of trade and services, and particularly environmental services. And I can feel a lot of kind of 15 years ago coming back to me now, with a lot of debate around whether how and when some particular environmental services should be liberalized, if it's sewage or the sort of deep infrastructure related services Ron was talking about that are kind of the core of the WTO concept. How do we demystify somehow the political argument around this question of trade and services? So that would be an interesting question for some of the government representatives on the panel if they'd like to tackle it later. But we do have 2 more speakers before I get all excited by what we do next. Crispin, the ICC has been really very actively engaged in the policy discussion on these topics in the WTO, I know. And I think if my intel is correct, you're actually planning to release a study early next year that looks at the intersection of WTO work and international trade rules and the circular economy in different aspects. And this is something, of course, a lot of developed and developing countries aspire to achieve. Can you perhaps give us a bit of a peek into some of the report's main headline recommendations and how they might be taken forward? And perhaps even what motivated you to do the report in the first place? And then I'll turn to you at the end. Crispin, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alice, and great to be on a panel that you're moderating again. Also, thank you, Hildegard and Ron, for the invitation to participate today, and for inviting ICC. Like Anna, well, I think she's probably got more experience than I do, but I'm certainly not a specialist in services. So it's been extremely useful to hear from Ron and Christine, and of course, Lim. He and I discuss these issues very often. And Peter, nice to meet you too, virtually. For those of you who don't know ICC, it's based in Paris, over 100 years old. It's the institutional representative of over 45 million companies, small, medium, and large, in over 110 countries. And we now have over 60% of that representation in developing countries. So when you mention the importance of taking into account developing country perspectives, Alice, that's certainly something that we do through our network. And it's one of the benefits of the breadth and depth of our network is that we're able to reach out to companies of all sizes in very different geographies. So just a few words on ICC. You asked what motivated us to get involved in this area. The ICC office was established in Geneva 2 years ago, and we were really looking at how we could engage more constructively and usefully around the private sector engagement in key global challenges, whether that's the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, biodiversity loss, for example, WTO reform, very important to our members, of course, given that they're such strong supporters of the international trading system, and also, of course, climate action. And one of the big issues for ICC, and we've raised this in our business priorities for WTO reform paper, which was recently released, is the importance of getting coherence between the different global agendas. And I think this comes back to the point that Lim articulated very, very well, that sort of the tension. And we need responses. Business wants rules and responses basically from the different international organizations, but it needs to be done in an agile way. So I think his suggestion of sort of new thinking and simplified methods could be, worth not just drilling down to on this panel, but also in the future. I mentioned climate. ICC has been very active around COP, and we're also the business contact point for the UNFCCC. And there's a general realization within our network and from our leadership, the previous chair, Paul Polman, who many of you will know, that there needed to also be action on complementary issues. So not just on climate, but also on other areas where we can contribute to sustainable issues, and that one is we've decided to put quite a bit of focus on the circular economy. And there's a growing interest not just from those companies in our network in the developed world, but also from developing countries. So basically 2 years ago at the World Circular Economy Forum, we started to develop our presence, and talking a lot to people like Ho Lim and some of his colleagues, Carsten, for example, and also a number of the more active delegations in Geneva, of course, including Anna and some of her colleagues. We thought that there was a gap in the research in this area, a lot of work around the definition of the circular economy, whether in goods or services, but a lack of research on the intersection between circular economy and the international trade system. So it was actually in the TESTI, the first meeting actually, which was launched in November 2020, I think that's right, Anna, that ICC Secretary General announced the launch of this study. And our partner, and I should say we've commissioned it, but it was actually written by the International Institute for International Trade. So Christoph Bellman and Peter Draper and their team. So I guess it was a long-winded way of explaining why we were motivated to get involved in the study itself. We're looking at, given the postponement of MC12, we're sort of looking at how best to launch the paper and the study and its recommendations. Probably we'll do so in the lead up next week to the ministerial declaration, which I understand will be on the 15th of December. And that's because one of the recommendations in the report is that the ministerial declaration itself treat or refer to the circular economy and the need for further action. However, the formal launch and discussion, again, we hope in TESTI would be at the next TESTI meeting. We're exploring that with Anna and her colleagues, so early next year. The main recommendations, and these won't surprise you, and you'll be able to see it next week, but I'm also happy to share in advance if people are really interested. We do recommend, apart from the reference in the ministerial statement, that delegations consider negotiating or taking up negotiations again on environmental goods and also on environmental services. So that's one of the main sort of negotiating related recommendations. The second one is to take a second look at the work that was done on remanufactured goods, and that also has implications for services. And the third one, which I think is also interesting in the sort of the short term, where we might get more immediate impact, is looking at how within the TESTI framework and also elsewhere, we could look at contributing from our network and our partners to sort of best practices frameworks, which don't rely on a negotiated outcome, but countries can implement more quickly if they wish. So that's a little bit, those are the sort of key recommendations. How we take those forward, it's to be discussed with the TESTI group and with Anna and her colleagues, but also with, of course, our partners and with Christoph and the Institute of International Trade. I'd like to think that ICC through its global network, and particularly our Environment and Energy Commission, could bring some sort of business perspectives to the discussion of potential lists. Although obviously, as Christine's outlined, there's been a lot of work done already in APEC. But certainly that's something that I think we could bring if TESTI decides to sort of go down that path. And then the second one, of course, is again bringing those business perspectives to potential frameworks and best practices that could also, I believe, be developed through TESTI if there was the interest, in a similar way that some of the other initiatives, like the MISMES initiative, has been looking at policy recommendations for government. So that's, I think I've answered the motivation, the recommendations, and then the possible way forward.
Yes, super. Thank you very much indeed. And I think we're all looking forward to seeing the report when it comes out, also given how topical the concept of circular economy and trade policy is. I'm going to turn last but absolutely not least to you, John, because your team at the OECD has long stressed the need to cut red tape to make it easier for services businesses to be able to navigate foreign markets. So I'd be really interested to hear the OECD's sort of current perspective on how access to environmental services might be improved. But I wondered if I could cheekily also ask you actually to speak to one of the WTO initiatives that's just come through, the Joint Statement Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation, which is again kind of a topic for real experts. And I wondered if you could explain for us very briefly what that initiative does in your understanding, and why you think it might be important for exporters or for importers of environmental services. So John, the floor is yours from the OECD.
All right, thanks very much. Well, I mean, Alice, you know, these arts of services negotiations that we've been talking about are something, you know, often take place in the back room and out of the public eye. But in the last month or so, there have been some very public manifestations and outcomes of these negotiations that I think are really important, because they can inform us about where we might go next on environmental services. And I think in there's also a bit of a kernel of an answer to Peter's question about whether it's good news or bad news to be talking about to have your issue taken up by trade negotiators. The first thing that we've talked about already is this APEC MRT endorsement of the reference list, which has been well explained already. But it's meaningful to have, for me anyway, to have had a consensus come together on environmental services in APEC. Christine and I actually spoke a couple of weeks before those meetings, and I was quite kind of cynical, saying, well, you're going to want to have some backup plans and some fallbacks and plans C, D, and E, because you know, it may be just a little bit too ambitious to try to get that endorsed straight up by minister, but it happened. And then even more astonishing, you know, maybe for some people, was last week there was actually good news coming out of Geneva on services trade. So the fact that this joint initiative on services domestic regulations was successfully concluded. We saw 66 odd WTO members representing over 90% of world services trade getting together to improve the business climate for services and to facilitate services trade. And they did this, I mean, congratulations to the members that made this happen in the WTO Secretariat. But they did this by agreeing on disciplines around transparency. So things like the prompt publication and availability of information on regulatory decisions, by promoting legal certainty and predictability. So clear practices for licensing and authorization procedures. Peter was talking about the complexity of how his industry works and having to work across borders. So anything that improves predictability and certainty to allow you know, investment decisions or location decisions to be based on as much clear information as possible is only beneficial. And countries taking steps to improve regulatory quality and facilitation. So streamlining application processes, recognizing professional qualifications, and ensuring that procedures are impartial. So you don't have to factor all this into your decision making. And these are very positive developments, both what's happened in APEC and what's happened at the WTO. First of all, with regard to the Joint Statement Initiative, full implementation of this initiative can lower services trade costs by over $150 billion US on an annual basis. And this is based on some research that the OECD has done, and there's a joint paper that's been put out by the OECD and the WTO Secretariat talking about the benefits of this agreement. And at a time when we're all struggling to bounce back from the impacts of COVID and what's happened on services trade. This is extremely important. But secondly, I think the fact that WTO members went ahead, notwithstanding the postponement of MC12, but they went ahead and just said, we're just going to do this anyway, because it's the right thing to do. Maybe the political focus of the ministerial meeting is not there, but it's something that's too important to delay. And to me, that says that there's a political recognition of and a political will associated with services trade that you don't always see. And to me, that kind of underscores that the timing, if you're looking at environmental services, this is a good time to be moving and shifting focus into this area, because there's a momentum on services trade that we haven't seen recently. It's the ability of countries to work together to improve the environment, the regulatory environment for services is something that should be capitalized on. So I think our discussion today is very important. The outcomes in APEC and at the WTO, Alice, as you say, are very much in line with what the OECD has long been recommending about the lessons from our work on the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, or analysis using the Trade and Value Added database to look at the linkages between services and how that spills over into goods and manufacturing competitiveness and exports. This momentum, and to think a little bit about what Peter's question about the advantage of having an issue addressed in trade negotiations. Think about 2008 versus this year. So in 2008, there was a WTO ministerial meeting that included a signaling conference on services trade. There were plurilateral negotiations. There were discussions on environmental services. And that was a long time ago, but this was kind of a classic request offer, mercantilist discussion. Services was linked to agriculture. It was linked to NAMA. And in the end, nothing very much came of it. What's happened this year is dramatically different because it was more of a grassroots, bottom-up, standalone initiative amongst WTO members that were interested in achieving concrete progress. The very fact that the announcement went ahead without any other linkages or tie-ins to the rest of the ministerial issues, I think speaks for itself. And it shows that advancing services trade issues are slow going and they're complex. And the formula includes things like having accurate measurements and benchmarking and clear evidence that clarifies the benefits of outcomes that governments can seize on. The formula includes a whole of government approach, because anybody who's worked in services trade knows that it's complicated to get line ministries and regulators all on the same page. So you need a strong engagement from central agencies and government to work across the government domestically to prepare yourselves for international negotiations. And then finally, you need multilateral coordination. So putting like what's been done in APEC, what's been done with the Joint Statement Initiative, to make it all come together so that the benefits are shared across as many governments as possible. Under those conditions, if you're taking that step-by-step broader approach, I think a trade policy focus to environmental services issues can be very beneficial. If you get tied up in political trade-offs and entrenched positions, then maybe less so. And I think what's really positive about what's been happening recently is there's been a creativity and a political will that we haven't seen so much in the past, and I think is promising for environmental services going forward. But we can come back to more of that in the next round. Thanks.
No, but thanks, John. That was fantastic. And I guess I have my answer. Under what conditions can trade policy and trade liberalization for services actually be beneficial, right? And ensure that, or at least set the conditions for trade negotiations to be able to move beyond their instinctively mercantilistic approach to these things. So perfect answer, John. I'll strike that list off my list of questions. We do have a little bit of time. I'd encourage those of you in the audience, if you would like to take the floor, feel free, in fact. because we have a small group, which actually means we can be a bit more flexible on the format the organisers have told us. So if you'd like to raise your hand and contribute towards the end, please do. If you are feeling a little shy, please put your questions or comments in the chat box, and I'll feed them in. But now, as promised, I'm going to give our panelists the right of reply to what they've heard. And Christine, I know it's getting late where you are, but your insights were really, really helpful at the beginning. And there's been a lot that I think I've seen you nodding along to as you've heard it. So would you like to respond to or add to anything that you've heard so far, specifically from Australia's perspective or your own personal perspective, as you wish?
Yes. That would be nice, and I'd love to do it from my perspective, but unfortunately I'm here in my capacity from DFAT, so I'll have to be a bit more muted. I have to say, talking about trade and services negotiators as mercantilist, I find it quite difficult because, and I think John articulated it well, because we're usually the most liberal people in a room of government officials. We're just constrained by domestic policy. You'd be surprised in terms of the advocates that you'd find on the floor in negotiations. John just mentioned the joint statement initiative on domestic regulation. Now, we got APEC to do an unprecedented statement from the Group on Services. So 21 economies, including ASEANs, who are not party to this agreement, released a statement saying they both welcome the conclusion of the negotiations and they encourage non-members to join. And so, you know, a lot of the time trade negotiators are the biggest free traders in the room. They're just constrained. But they work very hard to address behind the border barriers to trade. But I would say unilateral reform, particularly from Australia's perspective, is the best way forward for economies to just unilaterally reform. It's the best way to have growth. In terms of services negotiations, we work very closely with the OECD and with bodies that provide us empirical evidence on the benefits of the negotiation to our own economy. Environmental services industries have not provided us this evidence. It's not a coherent voice. One of the problems, the biggest problems for services negotiators is it is such a diverse group of participants, all who have a different argument that they are presenting to policymakers and to politicians. One of the comparisons, if you look at the agriculture or the mining sector, there is a strong, cohesive, clear political message that creates the political will. They back this up with an evidence base that provides just the ammunition to ensure that their interests are heard. In services and in environmental services, it's so unbelievably difficult to get a message out of industry on who is exporting, what are the barriers, how can we help you, how, you know, where are you getting sticking points, and a lot of it, you know, and you're asking us to go into a space that's incredibly complicated politically. You're asking us to look at visas and to open borders to your service provider and to have them move more freely than other service providers. We need $150 billion tag to that. So a lot of our service negotiators, we work really closely with John Drummond and with his team and with other economists. Oh yes, thank you, Peter. I know, I was just like, I got called a mercantilist so many times. I was like, oh my God, this hurts me. You know, we really need evidence. We really need a political economy to help us. You know, other sectors understand this, that we need the media to bubble up and to create an environment where our minister is the most powerful person in the cabinet room who can say, you know, I need to concede some really difficult stuff domestically. Services barriers are not at the border. They're at your local government. They're at the equivalent of, I don't know, Cooma in Australia. Like, it's a small, and you have to go in and say to that local governor, this is going to benefit you how? So one of the things I would really encourage industry is to say to policy makers what you want, why you want it, and why it is beneficial. We have so much will to help you. We would just love you to help us.
That's super, Christine. Thank you very much. And rest assured, you know, when we're talking about mercantilism, it's probably on the very en gros. And I might distinguish Australia's trade policy negotiators from many others who may tend to be a bit more mercantilist. So don't take it personally.
Can I? Oh, no, even that, like one of the most mercantilist countries in the room who was not a party to, was the one that pushed it over the line. Like, you would be surprised who you're publicly, they're not, but behind, like John Drummond said, it is a secret art, and your advocates are really not who you think it is, and your enemies are really not who you think it is sometimes. So I would.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. We need a whole other discussion, maybe behind closed doors. Okay, that's been super helpful, Christine. Thank you very much for coming back in. Ho, would you like to add a few more comments or responses to anything you've heard from sort of the WTO Secretariat's perspective, and then I'll move on to Anna and the others.
Maybe just very quickly, I mean, as you know, I used to be Secretary to Working Party on Domestic Regulation for Services, so it's great to get the result. I'm glad that John highlighted it, and then maybe just a couple of thoughts on how that can help services more generally. And as I think John has already highlighted some of this. I think it has the most success when what the negotiations are about are very much in line with domestic reforms that are taking place or have taken place already. So that may be one thing to think about, because in the domestic regulation services negotiations, never easy. I mean, the working party is still there for the multilateral. What we have is the plurilateral, but still, you know, I think, you know, at some point it became clearer that for many countries, it was part of their domestic policy reform anyway, to be, all John said, to be more transparent, to have more predictability, more certainty, improve the business environment, etc. And that's good for domestic business. If they were doing it anyway, it facilitates joining up with other countries. I think this is a sort of point I'm trying to make. So trying to find this within environmental services, and that's what I meant by change of mindset, would be to look at this as a win. I mean, I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't be looking for wins, but to look at the wins in a broader way, in a bigger landscape, and that links in with what are domestic policy reforms or objectives as well, which I hope that climate mitigation, adaptation are strong drivers for that. So those are very general points. Thank you.
Yeah, no, super. But I think it also speaks to an interesting, the question of the perspective we take to trade policy, right? I mean, is it sort of an end in itself, or is it meant to be a part of a broader policy drive towards a broader objective? And I think that comes up particularly, as we were saying, in the context of environmental protection. So that's really helpful and a good additional to the discussion. I might turn next to you, Anna. Anything you'd like to add or comment on?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. I've been taking a few notes and perhaps some comments I would like to share. First, remind you of the WTO's 2019 World Trade Report. There are some trends that the report brings up, and the impact of climate change is in the top 4. So it says that the impact of climate change will have the most disruption in trade in some services and will create new markets for environmental services. So this kind of disruption is an opportunity also for developing countries. Now, definitely from our national capacity, we have subsequently found the same main challenge or the same barrier to environmental services, and that has been historically the definition. But there's also work that needs to be done in parallel, not only work on the definition, and I think that the work that APEC has done is a milestone in this advance, in this way forward, but also in our capacity, in our national capacity. Costa Rica believes on being very strict in the criteria to keep the legitimacy of an environmental service, of what it is, of its definition, and that to communicate, it's not market access in disguise, but rather it has to be market access that contributes to the environment. I think that another important barrier to environmental services are those discriminatory and of protectionism or market access, as I mentioned, and regulatory barriers. But as we are talking on domestic regulation, those regulatory barriers can be fixed through domestic regulation, services facilitation, cutting red tape, and providing more transparency. And the discriminatory and market access barriers definitely can be addressed by improving the lists of commitments. Now, on the WTO perspective, the WTO platform, because I don't want to say multilateral yet, because we have the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. This is, I think, very timely, because right now, as previous speakers have mentioned, the structured discussions among as well as the other two sustainability initiatives, the informal dialogue on plastics and fossil fuel subsidy reform, will be presenting those ministerial statements that were approved by the ministers beforehand on a hybrid or virtual event on December 15th. This is very, very important, because at the moment we are 70 co-sponsors. This is, we have increased the number of co-sponsors since over the past few weeks. And this shows a very important political will that other speakers have also mentioned. Because more that along with domestic regulation, we want to be part of the good news that MC12 was supposed to deliver. So we are not waiting until the reprogramming of MC12, but we are presenting these initiatives, these statements, on the 15th to give us the way to open the way for the work programs that we have stated. In regards to TESD, we do have a very ambitious work program that will begin on February 2022. And in this line, what I would like to add is that TESD believes that as a platform of open and inclusive dialogue, we can depoliticize, and now that I've heard this, I don't know if it's the correct term, but demercantilize the issues as well. I think that it is a good opportunity for members to start bringing this conversation in a less restrictive way. Also, on a more public policy challenge that can be addressed in platforms such as TESD, I believe that regardless of the level of development, this is a place where members can put forward issues, for example, as technology transfer that Peter Brun mentioned. Technology transfer, and in my previous intervention, I talked about this. Technology and digitalization are fundamental, but for this tech transfer to happen, you also need education, and you also need capacity building. This implies investment in human capital, in education, and it is also a matter of coherence in the governance of public policies. So this TESD, I believe, offers the space to do this, to come full circle and have the conversation of all the different steps that developing countries and LDCs require to achieve these milestones. In our statement, we open the opportunity for members to explore approaches on how to facilitate access to environmental goods and services, and how to build together some kind of compendium of best practices that not only the developed members can provide, but we believe that developing countries also provide solutions and also are hosts for opportunities, because a lot of examples we can hear from are coming from the developing world on nature-based solutions, natural resources management, and a lot of examples that we believe are worth sharing. So that is our view from the structured discussions on how also to facilitate the work on environmental services and try to start dynamizing the conversation on both goods and services, and hopefully, make it evolve and turn into something, more tangible in the close term.
Yeah, super. And I think that's really, really interesting. And I think that's one of the really interesting steps, right, that the TSSD forum gives WTO members and stakeholders, is that ability to have more nuanced evidence-based discussions. I'm going to turn briefly now to our private sector representatives, to Peter and then to Crispin. Quick reactions to what you've heard so far, and then I'll turn to you, John. Peter first.
No, I think it's really great from an industry perspective to see that these talks have been reactivated, and I'm absolutely no doubt that this is honest and well meant. And please bear with me if I've been a little too direct, but sometimes it's good to have a provocateur in the discussion. And actually, I would like to say to you, since I was so deeply involved in the EGA negotiations, which happened to be a plurilateral negotiation, that actually what really was very successful in that context was actually, that the private sector also played in the negotiations on the sidetrack along the negotiations. And that's really, I think, the key for success in modern trade negotiation, really. Your ability to engage industry, come with the real cases, because the real cases are so compelling that you are embarrassing the ones who are restricting it or not agreeing to it. So this is what you need to play. And I'm not a good representative because I come from the two worlds. So I stand on both legs. You need to engage the real voices of industry here to get legitimate, but of course I will be playing in my best advice to you guys to actually make it happen, because as I say, and that's going to be my closing remark, it is a moral imperative now for all of us. We need to make this happen and contribute from all sides. That's what's at stake now, I think.
No, thank you very much, Peter. There's nothing like evidence to demystify and to depoliticize, and perhaps even to demercantilize where it happens. So thank you, that's super. Crispin, a few last comments from you?
Yes, thanks, Alice. Just very quickly, but I couldn't agree more with Peter's comments there. And also just to mention, of course, that ICC strongly supported the services domestic regulation outcome, and congratulations to Australia and Costa Rica. Also on this panel, but also and the EU. I was there at the press conference with the Director General, and obviously important from a business perspective as a specific outcome, but also more broadly as an indication that the organization itself can produce and can produce things that are important to business, which is the end user in the end, I think, of the system, or one of the main end users. Picking up on Christine's point about the industry voice, and that Peter expanded on a bit, I think it's a key point, and we've been trying to bring that voice to the WTO around e-commerce, for example. And I'm sure, Anna, you've seen your colleagues in e-commerce. We've done quite a lot of events, and in coordination with the co-conveners on specific issues that they're dealing with. In the margins of each of the the discussion rounds, we've done events bringing in, as you said, Peter, real business voices. And some of these things are pretty technical, and for negotiators who are very good at negotiating and have specialist knowledge, they may not have that specialist knowledge of business insights and concerns. So we've done that around e-commerce. We've done it within our network with services domestic regulation. The circular economy study has case studies, so specific business comments from our network. So Anna, that's something that we'd be interested in, as we move forward, having companies from our network speaking about some of the, not me talking on behalf of industry, but getting specific businesses to come in. And let's be innovative, like we've done with e-commerce. And Christine, we have an Environment and Energy Commission, which perhaps we've briefed our commissions on services domestic regulation, same on e-commerce. Why not do the same sort of thing as we move forward with some of the environmental services and goods issues? So thank you very much once again. Those are my last points.
No, super, thanks, Crispin. And I think maybe some of this evidence is what might bring some light to this dark room where services negotiators are chasing the black cat. So super to have you both involved. John, reactions, comments from you before I turn to the organisers for closing?
Thanks, Alice. Maybe just a few points. I wanted to build on something that Ho pointed out in terms of the lessons of the WTO work on domestic regulations. It's a very good point that you need to align multilateral action on the back of domestic interests and domestic reforms. One thing that doesn't work particularly well is just to kind of hammer away on a country or negotiators in Geneva or in FTAs saying, you have to do this because it's what we're asking you to do. You get resistance and entrenchment. But if I go back to kind of my 3-point formula and some of the actors involved, the common evidence base, the measurement and the benchmarking that can give concrete examples of how these domestic reforms are in the domestic interest, goes a long way to preparing the ground. And that's so at the OECD. So, the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index work we're doing right now to add in an environmental services to our sectoral coverage, but also to develop green or environmental STRI in terms of taking advantage of the deep database that we have on all different services, regulations and laws, to how all of those can contribute to achieving environmental policy objectives, I think will be an important tool to motivate action and reforms in environmental services. That can help to motivate whole of government coordination. And this is where also in terms of different actors, central agencies need to be engaged to motivate the whole range of line ministries. But it's also where advocacy from industry groups is super important. And we just talked about that, like whether it's the Australian Services Roundtable or the European Services Forum or the Coalition of Services Industries or the ICC, all of those voices helped to build up, can help to build up political will to address some of these complex issues and make that evidence base actually count in the political arena. And then finally, at the multilateral level, that's where the role of negotiators kind of working in parallel to all of this to help to codify and lock in and come up with instruments that can actually lead to meaningful outcomes in the context of the multilateral trading system. All those stars need to align, and they don't align by accident. They align by kind of hard work and persistence over time to get everything together. And it's discussions like what we're doing today, because the organizers have got people from all of those different actors and involved in all of those different parts of the formula having the right kind of conversation. So I hope this is just the beginning of this exercise, and we look forward to working with all of you going forward. Thank you.
That's super, John. Thank you very much indeed. And of course, building that evidence base is what the OECD does so well. So thank you for all the work you do. I've been a moderately successful moderator in that we have about a minute for closing remarks. Sorry, organisers, I've been very generous to your panelists because they were so interesting. But Ron, would you like a few quick words, and then I'll hand it over to Hildegund to close. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. Just great thanks to everybody on the panel, which I mean, if I do say so myself, I think it was a really well diverse and a panel that brought all kinds of perspectives, and super job, Alice, on moderating. I guess maybe the best thing is for me to just talk about two areas where I think there could be another dialogue, and picking up on something that Anna said about digitalization, and it was a really good point that she made about the value of digitalization, for example, in expanding the ability of women to work from home. But I mean, it's also extremely important in enabling a lot of an environmental services delivery. And I mean, we see that with remote control of wind turbines from gasification plants, in monitoring the air quality and all that. So that would be a whole discussion in itself. But also, coming back, and I absolutely agree with the stuff that Peter was saying. It's a bit of skepticism, and the one thing though that I think that, and again, the digitalization has improved, and perhaps accelerated by the whole COVID, is this whole idea of hybrid meetings. And so when I was participating in the multilateral discussions on trade and liberalizing trade in environmental goods, there was a lot of mercantilist perspective. And as an observer from the OECD, I actually said that at one point. I said, we're not hearing the environmentalist perspective here. This is something that ECO also stressed, the tension between mercantilism and global public good. So, and you can imagine with a lot of countries that can't afford to send somebody from capital with environment, from the environment. If they're going to have somebody in Geneva, it's going to be their trade representative. So opening, having the ability for people, particularly from the poorer countries, to be able to participate in some of these discussions, like T said, is really great. And I think gives a bigger perspective. I've said enough, but thanks to everybody, and hope to see you again on a similar workshop, webinar.
Super, Ron. Well, thank you for bringing us all together. And thanks also to Hildegun. And I will sign off now and give Hildegun the last word and the closing. Hildegun, go ahead.
Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion from real experts from many perspectives in this particular area, and I have really enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot from it. And I've also watched the chat, and I see that you are already making contacts between policymakers and representatives from the private sector, which is excellent. So we have brought together people that will continue the conversation among themselves. That's one of the objectives with organizing such meetings. And also a big thank you to Alice, who has moderated this in an excellent way. Let me also maybe make a couple of remarks from what I took from this discussion. I think it was extremely interesting to listen to what people have to say about the both opportunities and the limitations of international trade agreements and trade negotiations in this area. And I think it's also a bit of a distinction in the debate right now. You have trade talks on the one hand, and then you have trade negotiations, which are a bit different, because the talks are more explorative, and we are not quite into the negotiations in this area yet. And so I thought this was an interesting discussion also about the architecture and the pace of trade negotiations and their limitations. And on one particular area which Ron and I highlighted also in our report, which I think is important to discuss going forward. That is, of course, the digitization, and that leads us to discussions about data flows. And that is an issue in environmental services when you have monitors to monitor performance. So you have sensors that generate data that needs to be analyzed somewhere, and that means cross-border data flows. And other area which is difficult when you come to environmental services is public procurement, because many of these services are actually bought by and provided by not only government, but actually municipalities. So how to deal with that market is also a challenge going forward. And finally, movement of people. You need people to move to install and to repair equipment. So those three areas, I think, would be challenging going forward, not only looking at environmental services as kind of scheduling it and looking at market access and the national treatment of the service itself, but also to look at it in a broader context of trade agreements. So with those few reflections, thank you so much. And I hope this conversation can continue and we have food for thought for the research community, the policy analysts, and the policymakers to think about this together and find good solutions going forward. So thank you so much.